Hello everyone, this is Mini Ninja speaking. For today's episode of the Bootleg Breakdown Show, we're actually going to go over a bit of an older viewer request that only came in recently, and that was the SH Figuarts Golden Frieza knockoff. Now, as you can probably tell from the packaging and everything, this was based off the figure that originally came around the Resurrection of F's timeline in this case, so it is indeed a 1.0 figure, and the packaging is there, the match on there. And in terms of bootleg packaging, you get about what you expect with most of the official logos of the figure pretty much scrubbed off there, minus a little bit of the bluefin distribution and Tamashii Nation stuff that was left on the bottom that they must have missed in this case. But otherwise, it's pretty generic on there. Now, in terms of the figure itself, I mentioned this is a bit of an older bootleg, and as a result, I noticed something really weird, at least on the copy I got in hand. Namely, all the golden paint, specifically on this figure, was sticky. The whole finish of the figure was sticky, in this case probably because there was something weird going on with the paint job not fully drying. So, I actually had to go take this thing in order to give it a proper wash before we continued with the rest of the review. This being post-wash in this case, you can see that the figure is standing around a little over 4.5 inches tall, which is roughly the size of a lot of the other modern, and well actually I should say past and more present Frieza figures up to this point, but as we're going to do a little review later, his proportions are a little bit different. Now, in terms of general articulation check in this case, for a 1.0 figure, it's actually pretty standard in here, and it's actually fairly well done for the most part here. Everything moves as it's supposed to have there. You have the kind of drop-down hips, which is standard for the 1.0 figure, and everything. While some of the joints are a bit stiff, namely the shoulders don't move as much as they really should in this case, and the wrist joints, while they're not actually too snug, they're actually kind of loose if anything, but at least that means they're not breaking on you. They tend to be functional, although they, as you can kind of see there, they pop out real easy, I find. But at least that means you're not breaking anything, and in terms of the twisting and such on that, they tend to work just fine. Same with the head on this point. It moves fairly well, although the neck is notably stiff, at least on my figure, and the upper torso is also a bit stiff, I should mention. Now, in terms of the quality of the joints, you can kind of tell that they stick out in terms of the color scheme compared to the rest of the figure. That actually was a little bit of the case with the original figure as well, although you can kind of tell from the way the wrist joints stick out of the body in that case, that's using the wrong size joint, or at least they haven't been inserted the whole way, so yeah, there are definitely some clearance issues here and there which make the thing stick out. Also with the main body in there, you can kind of tell that things don't fit quite like they're supposed to, and as you kind of notice on the side there, because of the fitting issues, there's some definite paint rub issues that are going on there, and there was some scratched parts on the golden finish. So that is a thing that might be an issue with this particular figure. Going on to the heads and hands in this case, the original figure didn't come with a lot of accessories in general, but what was included has come over here in this case. So we have here kind of the laughing face that Frieza tends to have on here. It's pretty standard fare. Most of it is honestly just fine. You might notice that the actual gold finish on a lot of these heads are slightly lighter than what they have on the rest of the body, which is a tad odd, but still not too many shades different, so it's fairly acceptable. And pretty much the only thing I might note is that the face decals are slightly off kilter, it feels in this case in terms of placement, but even on the original release, for some of them, that was actually the case too, so it wasn't too bad off. Now, in terms of the hands, they're a bit glossier than what they should be in terms of the purple finish on there, and the actual sharpness of detail could be a little bit better, but generally they're still pretty decent representation of what the original hands were. And for a little bit of a more comparison, which is why I mentioned the size earlier, here's the Golden Frieza knockoff with a little more of a more modern Frieza in this case, and you can definitely tell in terms of the proportions, they have definitely upgraded or kind of bulked him out in future releases, and even the original one were a little more bulky in the body than what they had in terms of the this Golden Frieza here. You can kind of tell the arms are definitely a different size on there. The head is notably smaller on Golden Frieza compared to the newer one in this case. So while it stands a bit taller, a little bit of the joints having an issue to do with that, in terms of proportions, he is notably smaller on various regards here. Mind you, if you want to do a really fair comparison, you have to have the original figure in some format now, don't you? Which is exactly why I picked up the SEC exclusive figure in this case, where aside from the color scheme being notably different because they definitely upgraded it for the re-release figure, generally speaking, proportion-wise, you're pretty close on for the most part, minus a few nitpicks here and there, namely the ball joints on the ankles are definitely the wrong size and stick out, and definitely the wrong color for that matter. And the arms, because the joints are sticking out a little more than they should on the bootleg, they kind of extend the limbs a bit. Proportion-wise, you're actually pretty close, to be totally honest on there. And it kind of shows they tend to use pretty authentic joints for the most part. However, on the faces, as you can kind of tell, it's honestly a no contest here. The real one is notably better in all regards here. But it's worth noting in terms of the neck, they're actually pretty close in this case, so things are interchangeable, as well as the hands for that matter. This kind of really sells the issue I was mentioning with the kind of level of detailing on the hands on the bootleg in this case, the bootleg being on the right, of course. Definitely a bit gloss here, and the casting wasn't exactly perfect, but in terms of the wrist pegs, they're actually pretty close to, if not exactly the same on the ball end of things, so things should be interchangeable if you really need to. However, I can't say the same about the size of the tail here. Yeah, you can tell which one's the bootleg on that one. So yeah, that one sticks out like a sore thumb. However, now for the final part of our show here, the actual breakdown section itself. It's worth noting that for the most part, I didn't have too much trouble separating this particular figure for most of the joints here. Namely, the hips tend to pop out pretty easily because it's not excessively complex for the old 1.0 style joints. And the wrist joints, as you saw earlier, pop out much too easily. However, in terms of once you get to the upper body and particularly the neck and head joints, that's when I started having a little more trouble separating things, and that's because those ones were really pressure fit around where the ball joints were. So that is something you might want to keep in mind if you end up picking up this figure yourself and want to do some customization work. You want to dip these things in hot water and soak it for a bit in order to kind of help soften things. Now that we have things mostly disassembled in order to take a look at the last things, you can kind of tell that while this isn't the most complex figure by any means, there aren't a lot of accessories that go on there, and even the articulation, because it's based on the 1.0 stuff, is simplistic. At least I can say the silver lining is what is there works like it's supposed to for the most part. So I don't really have too many issues or arguments with this figure. In fact, I'd actually go to say that in terms of my real issues with the figure, it's probably that the faces are a tad goofy just because of the way the decals have been placed on there. And in terms of the paint job is probably my biggest issue, to be totally honest. I have no idea what they use in order to paint this particular figure, but the paint over time has gone stickier. It's as if the thing never properly dried out of the factory in this case, or they just used something that was a notably lower grade paint. So if you get this figure, I strongly recommend giving it a wash just in case, especially if you notice any rub off right out of the packaging. But once you do that, admittedly, you're not doing half bad. This is at least, I would say, a good filler piece in case you can't get a hold of the original release, or you just don't want to pay the admittedly absorbent price of the SCC recolor release that came out for the assorted events, because admittedly, those things aren't exactly cheap either. I'm not gonna lie, this has actually been a remarkably nice and smooth going review for this particular one, unlike the past few, and I wouldn't mind having some more like this. Unfortunately, I know that's not about to happen, and that's because, yes, we're going to do this again. Only this time, it's actually worse.